This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 2019, New York City passes a bill that transfers possession of Hart Island from the Department of Corrections to the New York City Parks Department. This may seem like a pretty obscure matter of jurisdiction, but it actually ties into all sorts of deep questions about this island, Hart Island, what it symbolizes, and how it is used. Hart Island is New York City's Potter's Field, the final resting place for New York's unclaimed and poor, going back for more than a century. You may have heard of it in recent years because at the height of the COVID-19 epidemic, it was used to bury unclaimed victims of the pandemic. And Hart Island is the subject of a new series from our Radiotopia friends at Radio Diaries, the public radio show and podcast that gives voice to ordinary folks telling extraordinary stories, some of the most beautiful first-person audio ever made, in my opinion. And the new series does just that. It tells the stories of Hart Island and the otherwise unknown people who are buried there and their families and their loved ones. The series is called The Unmarked Grave, and Joe Richman of Radio Diaries is here as our special guest. Joe, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for making this brilliant series.
Thank you. It was worth just for hearing that introduction. Thanks.
Well, there you go. And in addition to Joe, here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Joe, it is no coincidence that you're on just as we are kicking off the Radiotopia fundraiser. It actually is a coincidence we would have had you on regardless, no matter when. But I will just say to people that if over the course of this conversation you get a sense of the kind of work that can only be done through independent radio making and listener-supported radio, then maybe that will convince you to become a member of Radiotopia. We didn't bring you here, though, to put on the hard sell, Joe. We came to talk about this series. So I've heard the series. It's beautiful. It's personal. It's all these stories of folks who have been buried at Hart Island. And I want to hear about those, and we'll play some tape at the end. But you heard that hook that we used to get into the episode. And obviously our show is a little more public policy oriented. So do you want to start there in terms of this question of who controls Hart Island and this bill, which has set up this process by which I think for the first time access to Hart Island is actually going to open up, which, yeah, I think it ties into these really fascinating questions of what it symbolizes, who it's for. So who's Hart Island for?
Yeah, I mean, it just by way of your introduction, I mean, like the work that we're interested in doing is really the kind of the intersection of history and personal stories. So that's kind of what drew us really to Hart Island as well. You can kind of trace the history of New York and the history of a lot of things through this physical place, but also it's like it's an archive of personal stories as well. This cemetery that's been around for New York has been using it as the Potter's Field for 150 years. So, as you were saying, it's a big moment because for 150 years it was controlled by the Department of Corrections, and for many years inmates from Rikers Island were actually the people who did the burying on Hart Island, and that changed 2 years ago as it transferred to the Parks Department, and there are some small shifts. There have been small shifts over the last decade or so as families have been starting to be able to get access to it and that sort of thing. But the plan is to actually open this place up to the general public, not just for families, but to actually have it be something along the lines of a park. And having been there, it is a very special, sacred place to my mind. So I think that's a really good thing. This place that has been sealed off for so many years now has the potential to kind of be open to the public.
What I think is so fascinating about the renewal of Hart Island is that idea of a cemetery as a place for the public is how cemeteries were viewed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, right? It was the main place where people would go for a stroll. They were the main parks in cities. You would have picnics there. And that idea of living amongst the dead was not the kind of verboten thing that it sometimes feels like in U.S. cemeteries today. So I'm not entirely sure what this plan is going to look like and how integrated the park and the cemetery will be, but there is a kind of lovely callback to the combination of the two things.
Yeah, cemeteries were the first public parks. What I think is so interesting about Hart Island, though, is that it's not just any cemetery. To me, it's a place where the marginalized, the forgotten, the sort of cast away from society, it's where they went to have their final resting place. And I always saw it as sort of like an ostracized place in which you would bury your dead, almost like in secrecy. And maybe that's because I get that from pop culture. Like, I was telling Jody that I was a big fan of the show Pose, and there was like 2 or 3 episodes where they like buried the body of a trans woman activist there. They like murdered a man and buried him there too. Like, there's all this sort of like deviance about like who gets buried there.
Yeah, that idea of like cemeteries as a social landscape is so fascinating. I mean, my mom, as people may know, went to the convent for a few years, and one of her classmates had died by suicide and was buried outside of the cemetery because if you died by suicide, you couldn't be buried in a Catholic cemetery. We've talked about like cemeteries being segregated, right? They're social spaces, as well as kind of these public areas.
Yeah, on the idea of these, certainly this is a place that has been for people who have been kind of forgotten or unclaimed or unrecognized in some way. And the way we first thought about this series was kind of like obituaries for people who never got obituaries. That was a kind of our way into the series, what first drew me. And but each story kind of got a little more deep and interesting and mysterious. So they ended up being kind of like these much bigger kind of documentaries about kind of mostly about the lives of people who were left behind and trying to figure out who their family member was, or each story is a little different. But that idea of buried history and people who never got recognized in life, that definitely was the draw.
I think a lot of what we're talking about here is kind of dignity, right? And a dignity in death and a dignity in burial. And I'm curious I think I had a similar first impression as Kelly did of, there's not much dignity in the burial on Hart Island. But did you think about that? Did that change for you as you started to really get to know the place?
Absolutely. It changed for me a lot, but it also changed. We there were 3 different family members that we went to Hart Island with. And I would say the common experience is for someone who had a family member buried there to feel a lot of the stigma and shame, maybe want to disinter them, and then they go there, they visit, and they change their mind. That happens a lot, and that's sort of what happened for me as well. I mean, these are mass graves. There are about 150 bodies in each grave, and they're unmarked. So there's a lot that on the surface would seem like it kind of rubs up against a lot of what we think about. It is a dignified way to be buried. But you go there and it's an island it's like these beautiful trees, and it's like you also feel the history of the place. I mean, 150 years, 1 million bodies buried there. So there's something that just feels like sort of bigger in a way than just a cemetery.
I wonder how you thought about the labor history of this story, which is to say, Kelly talked a little bit about the marginalized in Potter's Field, and the people who were doing the work were also incarcerated, often from marginalized communities. Did you wrestle at all with the gravediggers?
Yeah, we and let me give a shout out to Melinda Hunt, who runs the Hart Island Project, because it's really through her efforts that we know a lot about who's buried there. And she said that when she first went there and she met a lot of the folks from Rikers Island who were doing the burials, that's one of the things she realized was these aren't just people doing the work here. They also have family members. They also from some of these communities. So they have a kind of more intimate connection to this place than she even realized.
Wow, that's really special. I can't imagine I think in my imagination, perhaps, the thoughts that I had of Hart Island were, I don't know, much more either darker or isolationist or even sinister. And I wonder how you transform a space like that into something that is sacred and something that is accessible to the public as well. Like, how do you transform that space into what people hope it will become?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say two things. But first of all, I mean, we're so screwed up about death anyway.
Yeah.
You're right about that.
That we got a lot of work to do in the first place. But I did go there with one of the stories is about a man, a composer who chose to be buried there. He felt he was kind of against the death industrial complex, and he kind of felt there was something beautiful and humble, and so he kind of like was won over by the idea of being buried there. So that was kind of not a choice that most people end up making, but he did. And I went there with his husband, who in a way at first was opposed to going there because he said, I'm not visiting him. He's not here. It's just his body. That was his attitude. But he got there and something changed. I think he felt the whole spirit of the whole place. So I think that's possible. You know, whatever your views are, I think just I don't know. It feels like there are certain places you can't ignore the feeling of, you know.
Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
A nuts and bolts question, and then I want to hear about some of the other people you've profiled and talked about. But for listeners who are curious, how does someone end up on Hart Island, getting buried there as opposed to in a different cemetery in the city?
I mean, there are a bunch of ways you'll be on a body will end up on Hart Island. A family can't afford the burial. A body isn't identified or claimed in some way. During, as you mentioned earlier, with some of the with epidemics throughout history, there have been a lot more burials. Hart Island got a lot of attention during COVID. During AIDS, about 10% of all New York City AIDS deaths were buried on Hart Island. It was really interesting during AIDS because at that time everyone was so scared of what AIDS was that people were buried for the first time in individual plots, and I think even deeper in the ground because people were so worried about what was this disease. So you can trace a lot of again New York City history through the way people are buried there, but generally it's for people who just aren't claimed and aren't recognized.
So as we said, it's moving to becoming this public space. I mean, it is worth pointing out so many of New York City's public spaces and iconic public spaces started out as potter's field or cemeteries. I mean, I live near Greenwood Cemetery, which is a working cemetery, but also this public space and has this really interesting tension or beauty, depending on kind of your mindset at any given moment between those two things. But like Madison Square Park, Washington Square Park, Bryant Park were all potter's fields originally, right? Because it's like, what was open space used for?
Yeah.
So what is your sense and what is your hope for what a more open Hart Island will look like?
Well, yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because we did a talk at the New York Public Library with the series and got to say that we're on a former graveyard.
That's right at Bryant Park, right? Yeah.
You know, right now it's just so hard to get to for families and for and for the general public, and you know, whether it's an issue of just like open space or just a place. I mean, as you all were saying, like cemeteries have a long history of just being public spaces, and I love cemeteries. I just love walking around cemeteries, just imagining all the stories that you have no idea what they really are, you know, etched on these, you know, in a few words on these headstones. So I don't know. They do something for me, and they do something for a lot of people, and I think it's worth kind of tinkering with the stigma we all have around death and dying and how we bury people, and Of course, there's an environmental issue as well. You know, on Hart Island, bodies are ultimately recycled. So there's a lot there that I think has potential to help us rethink some of the ways we think about death.
It's really strikes me, to bring my Catholicism back in here for a second. You know, the day that this park was transferred, the day that we're marking today, is November 2nd, which in the Catholic Church is All Souls Day, which is the day for remembering the departed. And that idea of kind of, you know, it's kind of the idea with All Saints Day and with Halloween, right? That the veil between life and death is thinner. And that's either scary or that's actually kind of comforting and magical, yeah. So I don't know. It feels special that this happened on November 2nd.
I have a question for you historians. I mean, like, death seems to be really woven into history. I mean, like, you know, this idea of timeline and, you know, just new ways to think about, like, what is time? I wonder if historians think about death differently than most people.
I do. I mean, this is going to sound really morbid, but, like, I study slavery, and the first thing I would always check is the death date to see if they lived to see emancipation or if they lived to see freedom. I always wanted to know that first for some reason. Maybe because it gave me a little bit more relief to study them, to know that they had lived to see that. But I don't know, maybe in a weird way, like a fandom, I kind of get a little excited when I go to like a burial plot. I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, Frederick Douglass was buried here. Last summer I went to see Ghana and to see W.E.B. Du Bois's final resting place. And I was so excited to see it. And people might be like, really? That's weird. But like, I don't know. There's something about being in a space that a person that you admire occupied and sort of seeing their mortality is powerful.
And there's also something, especially I think for enslaved people, Kelly, where the birth date is often not known, but the death date is. But also that idea of a kind of expansive freedom that comes with death. And that can sound a little bit morbid, but that idea of especially for people who lived very hard lives, I think we comfort ourselves with the idea that there is a kind of freedom on the other side, or rest. And so I think that imbues it with a kind of specialness.
Yeah. I think if anything, this series, like, this reminds me that, like, what I think we set out to do is to battle anonymity. You know, like this is like a place where there's not only do we not know who's buried there, but the fires destroyed a lot of records in the 70s. So we don't even know what we don't know. So, you know, the Hart Island Project has worked to kind of create this database, and there's a lot there now. But still, just like trying to rescue people from like infinite anonymity, I think just is something that kind of turns me on.
I mean, yeah, well, it makes you a good reporter and a good radio maker. But, you know, I think for all of us, and certainly for the historians, certainly for you, Joe, I feel like you see a birth date and a death date, and you can take that as an invitation, right? There's a story there. There's something, a thread to pull on there. And so that's, I think, part of why you find so compelling. And, you know, when you go to a cemetery, as you were saying, you know, you see this one line at best that sort of tries to summarize someone's existence. It's an invitation to kind of do some storytelling. But as we wrap up, you know, sometimes you didn't even have that sort of invitation, that name or that date, Joe. So how much of a challenge was it to find these stories? What was your approach in finding these stories? You can mention a few of them, though I don't want you to. I want people to go and actually listen to them. But kind of what was the process here of even finding those threads to then start pulling on?
Yeah, I mean, we went through just tons of stories looking for ones that felt like they could be told in the way that we tell stories, you know, sort of through family members and through first-person storytelling. And so there's all sorts of – there's a writer, Dawn Powell, who was forgotten after death, but she was a pretty well-known writer in her time. There was this one I mentioned about the guy who chose to be buried there. There's a woman who lived in a hotel for 40 years, the Belvedere Hotel, and kind of died anonymously. She was known by the residents and the people who worked there, but no one knew anything about her. I think the story that most kind of stands for this series, though, is about this guy Neil Harris, who was a homeless guy on the Upper West Side in a park, sat on the same bench every day for 2 years and became a kind of a fixture in the neighborhood. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him. They brought him food, all that sort of thing. And, in New York, we all know people like that we sort of get to know in our neighborhood, even though we know nothing about them. And he died, and no one had any idea anything about him until just a reporter from the neighborhood ended up stumbling on a database of missing persons a year later and saw a photo with a different name of someone who looked like him and managed to match that up with the mother who had been looking for him for 3 years. So it's sort of these two stories, side-by-side stories that just accidentally found each other. And I think that's the kind of story that's buried in Hart Island. These stories that maybe would never have connected, but maybe through a fluke of luck or something or some reporting, we get to find out a little bit about them.
Well, look, it is a beautiful series. We're going to play a little tape as we go out and people will get a taste, but you can go to radiodiaries.org/graveyard. You can find the Unmarked Graveyard series, wherever you get your podcasts. One more gentle reminder that if you want to support this kind of work, that's why you become a member of Radiotopia. I will also say, Joe, you have an event. I think people will have time if you're listening and you're in New York City, although it's also being live streamed, right? Is it November 9th?
Thursday, November 9th at WNYC's Green Space. We're doing a live event with some of the characters and some of the stories. And it would be great to have anyone in the New York area come and see us.
Yeah. If any of our listeners end up there, please go say hi to Joe. And it will also be live streamed. So we'll put a link in the show notes and you can go check that out. And of course, we'll put a link to the series itself. But Joe, thank you so much for making this. We're honored to be part of the same network as Radio Diaries. So this has been
Love you all. Thank you for doing your show.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Neil Harris was last seen in Inwood, New York on December 12, 2014.
Hi, Fifi. There were thousands of questions. Where's his family? Where's his people?
Uncle Caesar was estranged from our family for 40 to 50 years.
The playwright, novelist, and author of Happy Island, Miss Dawn Powell.
Holy shit, I know that person. And it's got a name attached to it. Neil Harris Jr.
You can't help but wonder what her life has been.
I never went back and I never looked for him again.
Annette found you, she found us, and we're here. Now we know where you are.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia.